I welcome everyone and anyone who ever listens to this recording. Now, today's topic is something very, well, we might say practical in the sense that we are not just moving in the theoretical choices that we can make. And what I mean by this is that we will speak about, very specifically about the first feather, that is the identity view, because this is the very first thing that one must and shall eradicate in order to progress on the path and attain the fruits of an arahant, whether it be a Pacheka Buddha, an arahant, or a Samasa Buddha. It all begins with giving up the identity view. So if you looked upon the picture of this video, you see that we called it the blissful annihilation. Now, first I want to look at this a bit because this is not in fact the right way to say it. The best way to say it is the blissful cessation. Now, what is the difference between annihilation and cessation is the following. You can annihilate a planet, that is, that there is something which is there and then you forcefully or effortlessly you get rid of it, and that is called an annihilation. Whereas cessation would mean that there is something that you see that it might be there, but in reality it is not there as it presents itself. So when you realize the dream nature of that certain thing, for example, the identity that we shall speak about, then for you, identities cease to be. In fact, you don't annihilate it, you let it cease. Now, the reason why we still use annihilation is because people think, beings think that there is something there, so-called identity, who am I and what do I possess and such things. And therefore to show a way that yes, you have to annihilate yourself, so to say, in the terms of identity and all the other feathers, of course. We say annihilation because if we don't understand what cessation means, we would think, yes, I have attained perfect cessation of all things. And then we might not even see that in such a statement there can be even conceit, which of course is a higher feather, but is still there. So this is why we use powerful words such as annihilation, because it shows a clear way that it has to go, that it has no place there. And now you might ask, why does it have no place there? And then we shall start the whole topic of identity. Now, the very, very first thing to understand about identity is the following thing. So just to lay the foundation of this speech, you have to speak about 3 types of poisons and 3 types of characteristics, because we have to use all these 3 up in order to the 2 trees to understand. Now, the 3 poisons, or sometimes called 3 thieves or 3 fires, are greed, hatred, and delusion. Now, why these are the 3 types of poisons? It can be another type of Krishna Speaks. So greed, hatred, and delusion are the 3 poisons, whereas the 3 characteristics are no self, suffering, and impermanence. Now, what is the difference and why do we speak about these 2 trees? Now, the number one, the 3 poisons are called poisons because these are the 3 things from which all, we might say, suffering comes. Because all 3 are in a way desires, and we know that suffering comes from desires. Now, these are the 3 types of so-called desires. Because in greed, you desire the presence of something, that you want it to happen. When you have hatred, it means that you desire the absence of something. I don't want it to be like that. And then delusion which in fact includes doubt and restlessness, in fact, that is in the sense desire that there's always this kind of shaking, that it is not firm and the mind is not firm and established, but it is scattered. This is why it's a third type of desire, so the third type of thing that makes suffering. So these are the three ways through which we enter the realm of suffering. And of course, all these three have different manifestations. So even if we look at the fetters, we see that greed is powerfully present in 4 of the fetters, that is identity, sensual desire, fine material and immaterial rebirth desire. In these 4, greed is the predominant factor. And then hatred is in ill will, and in fact in also some other as a latent tendency. And greed is also present in fact in the belief that ceremonies will lead to liberation. Here greed is not powerful, but as there is a kind of attachment to rituals, greed becomes a factor in the background, because in general the belief that there is liberation through ceremonies is maybe considered as delusion. Okay, so these are the 3 fires: greed, hatred, and delusion. And the 3 characteristics of impermanence, suffering, and no self are, we might define, those 3 things which apply to all phenomena. All conditioned things possess these 3 elements. That is, there is impermanence. I will give an example. I might think that my experience of joy is permanent, and therefore, well, I will suffer because I don't see that it's impermanent, that right now it's here, but that it is conditioned by the object in question, for example, towards which I feel joy. And then I have to see that it's impermanent, because when the object goes away, also the joy goes away. So this is impermanence, that we understand that in the 5 aggregates of form, perception, feeling, mental formations, and consciousness, there is impermanence, namely moment to moment, they are not steady. They continuously change, like a flux of change. This is what is meant by impermanence, that from moment to moment, the body is not the same, because, well, even the fluids move, so you cannot speak about the same kind of body. Then if we speak about feeling, I mean, that is the thing that is most changing out of the 5 types of feeling, of mental joy, mental suffering, mental equanimity, physical joy, which is pleasure, and physical suffering, which is pain. Out of these 5, these continuously change as well, so they are not permanent. Then if we speak about mental formations, that is, for example, an opinion, we cannot say that they are permanent, because the mind gives rise to it. That is, when you think about it, it's there. When you don't think about it, when you don't give rise to it, it's absent. So it's not something that continuously is there. You just continuously create it out of memory, but it doesn't mean that it is permanent. Then perception, what we perceive, for example, even to the 5 senses, is also impermanent due to the 5 senses being not a perfect equipment to see even the material world, because, okay, our eyes are very precise object with which we can see, but it by no means shows us truly what the outside is, because also the eyes and all the 5 senses have deficiencies. That is a fact. And then lastly, consciousness, as I said, experience and the flow of experience just continuously changes moment by moment. The moment you take a breath and then you concentrate on that, and the next moment, even if you concentrate on the same thing, you still jumped from moment to moment. there is still a continuous flow of experience. So in none of the five aggregates that are formations, you could find permanent things. And then suffering comes because you think that something is permanent, that is steady, and in fact it is not. So it will bring suffering due to attachment to it. And then no self means in fact two things. That as there is no self in the sense of the word, that there is no soul, there is no being in the body, there's no being anywhere. And slowly we will get to identity out of all this, that you understand that there are just phenomena, continuous happenings, like many rivers flowing. And this river which flows here, I would call it myself, and that river flowing there, you would call yourself. But as the river is never constant, instead there is just a continuous fluctuation of experience. That is the first to understand in no self, that nothing has a fixed reality that you could call the self, that the essence of that certain thing. Not even happiness has an essence, because it is just a continuous fluctuation, a scattering of experience. And the same applies to all kind of types of consciousness that one may encounter. And the no self also means that you are not 100% you in the sense of the one who in the formations, in what the experience happens, you're not in absolute control, because this life is the resultant of previous deeds, and therefore these deeds create the resultant in future lives if one does not get to arahanthood, and then nothing continues, of course. So this is what also no self means, that you don't try to change, alter the things. So for example, of course, the way you react to things, that is in one's hand if one is mindful, but with what people you meet on the street, that is not necessarily. And this is what we mean, that we don't control things, as there is no self that could control, rather there is just the active creation of it, different types of consciousness, and the resultant. So that there is no controller, there is only just the continuous flow of phenomena. This is the no self. Now, identity, if we know the three poisons and the three characteristics, what would be identity? Well, identity out of the poisons is two. Identity is greed and delusion. Now, whenever there's greed or hatred, delusion is inevitably in both of them, because that is the underlying reality, that through delusion one has greed or hatred, because it means that one doesn't see the danger of greed and hatred. Therefore, there's a delusion, a veil on the mind to see it for what it is. And therefore, identity is to be seen as greed in the sense that you are attached, one is attached to the five aggregates. That is my body. This is my perception. This is my opinion. That is what I like. This is how I experience life. All these things. And even if you say, oh, I am not this, I don't see it as such, this is not my opinion, these are also identities, because identities can be affirmative or negative with respect to the object in question onto which we build or negate the identity. So identity is fundamentally greed, because there is an attachment to the five aggregates. I am this and not otherwise. I am that and not otherwise. And delusion, now delusion can be in fact restlessness and doubt. Now there is in identity, there's a powerful restlessness, because there's a continuous effort, a continuous friction in the mind to defend this identity. There's a continuous being scattering, that the mind is not steady. When the mind is purely steady, there cannot be any kind of identity, because identity is like hitting the mind with a metal, and then it would just scatter and just continuously move. And this is how identities come to be. Now, first, we have seen that it is based on greed. So it's important to see that it is greed. It is nothing else but purely greed and delusion in the background. And the next thing, if we understood why it is greed, because it comes with the attachment, with the desire to be this, to have this, because even the identity is a desire to have something. I want to be this, I have to have this kind of an attribute to myself. I am this family, those are my friends. Now, if we saw that identity is based on greed, we have to look upon the three types of characteristics, and we have to apply them, all of them. This is in fact called insight, because you want to see what it is, what there really is. And sure, there's greed and delusion. Now, in order to shake up the mind from its dream of having identities, we have to look upon these three characteristics. And I want to start with the continuous change, which means impermanence. It is best if you start with impermanence, because with the other two, you might still say, oh yes, I suffer because of these identities, but then let me just take another identity which will equalize my suffering. And then you would think that you did a great job covering up the madness, but in reality, you have not. And this is why we start with, it's best if to start with impermanence. That is to say, rise and fall. If you look upon an identity, you have to see it as not something which has always been there. Let's say that you are a friend with that person. That is your type of identity. That is my friend, and that other is not my friend. Okay, you have to understand that the reason for which that being A became your friend and being B did not, wasn't there from the beginnings of time, if we want to say it as such. It means that it is a consequence. It is conditioned by the actions, the things that happened previously, that then decided who is your friend and who is not your friend. Namely, it is not something which has been eternally together with you, that certain being became your friend in particular, and the other being has not become your friend in particular. And you understand that it just came to be, not by chance, but it hasn't been there with you for all time, for all your incarnations. It is just something that happened. If let's say that you are an absolutely outsider and you see two beings taking a walk in the park, namely that they are two friends and they identify with such a thing. And then you would see that there are simply two forms exchanging different type of information with each other. And that's all what happens in reality. And that is the reality of things, that friend and foe are just mental formations, opinions about the other being. And therefore you have to see it as impermanent, because it came to be, and it also goes, because they are your friend because when you give rise to the thought of, yes, they are my friend. When you don't give rise to it, namely you go to sleep, and you will go to deep sleep and not just dreaming. And in deep sleep, for you, there is no friend or foe, because you don't have mental formations in that moment. You don't have opinions and feelings. Therefore, you see that it comes to be and it goes away. It comes to be and it goes away. And when you see that it's impermanent, truly all your identities, even if you identify with a certain, that is a certain nation, that is some hardcore there, because first you have to understand that a nation, a border, is not something really there. If you went to the moon and you looked upon the planet, you wouldn't see any borders, you wouldn't see a single thing which would make you cut the earth into pieces of different nations. A nation is something which is only in the mind. It is nowhere else, neither on this planet nor in the universe anywhere else, because it's also just a consequence. Borders are also just a consequence. The language you speak is also just a consequence, let alone to say that we have already discussed that even the language that you speak, on whose basis many times people say is that I am American, because number one, you were born somewhere which is called America, which is of course just a word, it has no meaning to it. And the other one is that you speak that language. Now, of course, in America you can speak many other languages, be American in the sense as people use it, but I just want to say that even our language is just a consequence of discrimination. We have spoken about this. I don't want to go into this right now, but fundamentally, to give a little insight to this again, language comes because we discriminate. Discrimination in the sense that you take that this is A, and that is then right away you have a discrimination. And then you use words in order to describe your discrimination. And words are random syllables put together, random sounds put together, and you have to see it for what it is. Those are just sounds that you put together and you hallucinate a meaning to it. This is what a language is. And therefore, identifying with languages is to identify with random sounds one after the other. And then you already see that taking the identity as I am of this nation because I speak this particular language becomes fallible, becomes something that you don't want to engage in anymore, because you saw that all those things that you take as an identity is just a consequence of something else. It's not something eternal, something that is there forevermore. This is an illusion. Nothing is forevermore. I want you to understand this. It just comes and goes, and that's it. And when there is pride in identity, it is simply that you are so attached that you create certain feelings to it, and then pride becomes another level of identity in that sense. So you have to see that all these identities, my language, my nation, are only in the mind and in the mind alone. They don't have an existential reality. Namely, they exist only if you make them exist. Besides that, the wind blows, life happens, there is no room for identity. If you look upon nature in itself, if you look upon the way life happens, the way life goes, life does not include any identity. If life included an identity, it would mean that there is bias, partiality in life. Then let's say there would be only male beings on a planet or female beings on the planet, because that would be life's identity. And you see that you are also life, and the moment you take on an identity, you say that I'm a male and this is what I identify with. If life went by your logic, then only male beings would be on the planet. And of course it happens, it was just an example, it can happen for any other being or any other concept that comes from the mind. You realize that it creates bias and destruction. You want to further cut things as if it weren't cut enough just yet. So to see that this is greed, and you start to destroy this pillar of eternalism, because identity comes from the opinion, from the view that that is something eternal, that it will be with you forevermore. And then you realize that even when you go to sleep, your identities, well, if you don't dream, if you go to deep sleep, your identities are gone. And then you recreate them every morning as you wake up and you say, yes, I am this being, this is my favorite color, my favorite food, but I don't like the other ones. And you just refabricated a whole castle, which wasn't even there. You just felt the need to express that greed towards whatever object. So when you shake this up, all this eternal view of identity, then you see that it starts to fall down, because you no longer find delight, because the only reason for which people think that identities are important is because there's a delight, because they don't feel alone, because if you had no identities, your first reaction might be, well, I'm alone. And yes, you would be in a sense alone, because you would not find a single piece of land, metaphorically speaking, onto which you could land and say, I have arrived to this, like namely to jump from one identity to the other one and change it with the circle of time. You wouldn't find a single place onto which you could step and say, that's mine. Or you couldn't find an object or a person to which you could say, that is this person who belongs to me in this and that way, and that other being not. Because you would understand that when you say that that is my mother, that is my father, yes, we say it out of convenience. Because yes, that this body was conditioned by those other two bodies, and this is what father and mother mean. But fundamentally, when you say that they are yours, you say that you are the body. And then we arrive to the next stage out of the three characteristics, that you said that you are the body, that you assume that there is a you. And in fact, the no self is very easily proven by impermanence. Even if you say that that is the self, that is I, that is me, it is the I that I speak of, then you look upon impermanence, which you have understood because you have the insight to understand that there is a rise and fall, a continuous push and pull in things, and they rise and fall and they happen to me and they cease to be. Then you understand that, okay, there's impermanence, and even if I denote a self to me, let's say, to the body and to its experiences, you will slowly run away from that idea, because you understand that even that denote itself is impermanent. Therefore, you will not be able to speak about an experiencer, because who is the experiencer? The body changes constantly, the consciousness changes constantly, the mind changes constantly. How come you say that the experiencer, just the experiencer, doesn't change when the experience continuously just happens again and again? Therefore, you cannot even name an experiencer, because there is no experiencer which would be the same in two consecutive moments. And then you see that there is no self either, neither in you, so to say, nor in the different phenomena such as different type of consciousness. Let's say that there is another being. So you will not see selves neither in yourself, in this form, nor in other forms, not other formations. And it's important to understand that, in fact, this phenomenon of the human being is not different from all the different phenomena, like types of consciousness or happenings or different formations. They are not different. It is just because through delusion, we think that there is a being, particularly in this form, that we separate it to identities and no self. But in fact, you have to see that there is no self in anything, in anywhere in existence, whether it be conditional or unconditional reality. There is no self in it, that there is no to say that is it, that it will not move. Okay, you might now tell me that things that are beyond this world, such as Nirvana, is already unconditional, and it is permanent because it doesn't change, and it has no suffering in it because that is the cessation of suffering. So why do you say that there is no self in it? Because if you would start to impose a self on it, you would deceive yourself and say that, there will I find the self, and you will misguide yourself, and there is no need to have such thoughts. Yes, when we speak about the Atman, or the self, with other words, it has nothing to do with I-ness. It has nothing to do with that. When I say Atman, I mean Buddha nature. I mean that fundamentally all beings possess Buddha nature, that is the capacity to go beyond identities, greed, hatred, and delusion, in generally speaking. And that is what I mean by the Atman, that there is the possibility of complete enlightenment or liberation. So that is why not even to permanent and non-suffering things we don't impose a self, because it has nothing to do with the I-ness. It has a very subtle Atman, subtle reality of Buddha nature, because Buddha nature certainly cannot be taken away, because that is something which is always there. That is always a possibility of liberation. Even in hell realms, for hell beings, there is the possibility of liberation, not from the hell itself. Yes, they liberate from the hell and they go to a higher realm, such as the human. But what I mean is that even they are capable of letting go of greed, hatred, and delusion at some point in the near or further future. So you slowly see that identities, whatever identity you take, you will understand that it is impermanent, because it just happens to be and then it ceases to be. That it has no self. So the moment you understand that there is no self, right away you understand that identity is a very shallow water. And then the third one, which is suffering, now it comes, if you look upon any kind of identity, you name it. I will give just an example. I like the red color. And if I'm truly identified with my likes and dislikes, if somebody says red is the ugliest color ever seen in the absolute total existence, from the hells to Nirvana, then I might feel that I am offended. The moment you're offended, it's because of identity view and because there's suffering. Because all identities bring suffering. Might not be in the moment, this might not happen in the moment of the taking of the identity, but the moment you take the identity, you have just entered, again, a burning house. Because yes, in that moment you might feel that it's so beautiful to have such likes and dislikes, but when you see that conditions you, and then you will seek something which is similar to you, and then you have a community of people who like the red color, then you see that you have started a rebellion against red haters. And then there's suffering, because the moment you're offended, there's just suffering. Being offended is another way to say that you suffer. You know, we have many words to describe suffering. Regret, pain, being offended, all these words. Many colors with which we can describe suffering, but fundamentally it is suffering. To feel that you're not well with something is suffering. To be irritated is also suffering, because these continuously change into one another. Even if you feel lovely because of the identity you took, it is just a question of time when you will suffer the consequences of greed, because greed as an unwholesome type of consciousness creates its resultant. It creates the results of other attachments, because you might say, oh, just because I'm attached to a color that is my favorite, it doesn't mean that I really will suffer. Okay, you might say that, but human life is not just about liking a color. With liking a color, you also entered many other words, because it is true, it will be true that it won't be your only liking. So you enter a whole other bunch of identities that you take at that moment. And so it might be that your attachment to the red color, as this example, will not make you suffer in that, in an evident way, but all the other things that come with attachment will make you suffer. So you understand impermanence, no self, suffering. And at that moment when you see the danger in identities, you saw how fearful it is to have identities, because I want to tell you that most of the most dark things done on this planet come from identity. And all those beings who end up in lower human worlds, lower worlds of existence than human, such as hell or animal realms, it all also comes with a certain type of greed. Now, of course, not all greed leads to lower realms, because even to higher realms you can get to greed. Not even a non-returner has given up all greed, because they might still want to go with the 6th and 7th feathers to find material jhana and the material jhana. So what I want to say is that even higher planes of existences are in a way damnation, because you're still conditioned. Because your lifetime there, well, you either live as an arahant and then that's it. But if you don't, then it is just conditioned and it will pass, and then you don't know where you will arrive in the next. Because, you know, what your rebirth linking, what your next life's fundamental type of consciousness will be, that you cannot really say, because you might have wholesome and unwholesome and jhanas, wholesome and all those things. And what will be your next is unknown. At least at this moment, mostly it's unknown. So that is why identities have to be seen as fearful and as dangerous, because they lead to further suffering in samsara, in the cycle of existence. And then you will at this moment you have to become dispassionate, disillusioned with all these identities. In fact, what we are discussing right now are so-called insight knowledges: rise and fall, dissolution, fear in it, the danger of it, how you become just disillusioned about it all, how you want to get liberated from it. And now, you know, how you get liberated from it is insight. You simply understand its root as greed. And I want you to understand, when somebody commits sexual misconduct of the worst, let's say, and the moment you have an identity, the same kind of poison you take. Yes, of course, they have different powers, they have different type of consequences, but fundamentally the root, the poison that you take is greed. So this is how you can shock yourself out from the world of identities, that you understand that the same way when a killer finds pleasure in killing someone, after killing someone in greed, the same kind of poison you take when you commit to an identity. Whatever identity it might be, whatever identity, in a way you take 1 gallon of poison or just 1 drop of poison. That is the same kind of poison. It is of different quantity and quality, but fundamentally the same kind. And this is how you can shock yourself out from identity views, that this is mine and that is not mine. You see that it's impermanent, it has no self, and it leads to suffering if you continue the identity. And then when you're completely neutral, you're completely equanimous towards the formations of identity, at that moment, if some other things happen, because, you know, this is just the first feather, but if you have given this up already, because see, identity is the basis of all the other feathers, because in a way you build them on the identity. It means that the moment you quench, eradicate identity, that you think that you can find something that belongs to you or is you yourself, the moment you eradicate this view, already your sensual desire weakens, because it many times is based on identity. Your hatred weakens because it's based on identity, many times. In the sense that because I have this type of greed and you have different type of greed, now I cannot accept your type of greed, only my greed is true. Now you can look upon this with religions. My type of greed towards my type of delusion, how I look upon things, is other than your type of greed towards whatever, whoever, what said, and therefore my greed and your greed are not compatible. And you have to break it down to greed, hatred, and delusion. And this is when we say you take nothing personal. And it doesn't mean that there's a person, you just don't take it personally. You eradicated the notion of being, the notion of a self. Because, and you see, as it becomes weakened, all the other feathers are somewhat weakened. Even the higher feathers are somewhat weakened the moment you destroy identity. The moment you destroy a feather, all those above it become weakened, because below it there are no more feathers if you have eradicated a certain one. So you first it might be a frictionful process to not look upon anything with the notion of an I, that you simply don't try to find anything personal in it. Yes, I understand it might be full with suffering in the sense that you have to eradicate it, but you have to understand that if you eradicate it now, then there is no more arising of this. What do I mean by cessation? Is the eradication with no future arising. It means, just imagine, just try to create a state within your mind where you are so free of hatred that you're not even capable of being irritated. Just try to see something like this, that even if I come tomorrow with a jigsaw and I try to murder, and one, not me, but one tries to murder you, even then you wouldn't feel not even irritated. Yes, you might feel suffering, of course, but not irritated. Now, this is what means, let's say, eradication of cessation of hatred. And this is how you have to look upon identity, that you will simply not be capable. You will lose even the capability to think in terms of identity. You will not feel that it has any, that it would bring anything for this life, that it would help you grow. You will simply see it as empty, that there is this body, but there is no self in it. It is empty of a self nature. And you will see all the different types of experiences that you might have, such as joy, suffering, that they themselves don't have. The moment there is no self in it, there is no experiencer in this mind. At that moment, not even the outside experiences, such as outside in the sense that joy or suffering or whatever type of feeling might come, even then you will not find the self in them. You will see it as a river flowing through your mind, through the mind, in fact, not your mind, through the mind, completely impersonally. That is the flow of action. That is the course of your life continuum, so to say. And what happens is that, yes, it might be frictionful as you try to eradicate, but when you eradicate it, you have destroyed, in a way, in some ways, greed. Of course, there is other greed in you, but this no longer has a hold on you. It means that you already find bliss as having no more greed, hatred, and delusion with identity, that you have nothing to do with identity from that point to the future ever again. And it brings bliss which is unconditional, because when you feel happy because you met somebody which is the same like you, your bliss is conditioned by the being in question with whom you met. But the moment your bliss comes from the cessation, from the eradication of something, it means that it becomes unconditional, because it is not there because something happened, because cessation means, again, it never again arises in the future. From the moment you eradicated it, if you truly eradicated something, it has not even a slight chance to come up in any way in the near or far future. Even after moments of eradication, it cannot come. Now, there's another interesting question that we can look upon. Is there a difference between conceits and identity? And the answer is yes, because identity is a lower feather, namely the first, and conceit is the eighth feather, so it is part of the higher feather. Now the difference between identity, having an identity and having conceit is the following. There is always conceit in identity. In a way or another, there's conceit in identity. Conceit means not necessarily arrogance. Conceit means that you are, I shall say it, satisfied with what you know or with what you think you know. And there's always conceit in identity, but identity, conceit can exist without an identity. Let's say that there's a being who has eradicated all the feathers up to conceit, but not conceit itself. Well, what happens is that if there's conceit, what they can feel is that they are satisfied with their knowledge, that they say there is this great knowledge that this mind is capable of comprehending. And this is conceit, of course, because it's already something like, I know this more and I know more than somebody else. I'm equal to somebody else. I'm greater than somebody else. I'm lower than somebody else. Not in terms of identity, but in terms of, even if it's true that an arahant is higher than a stream enterer, that is a fact. However, an arahant is no longer capable of thinking in terms of identity, even of conceit, who is greater, who is less great. Simply they have, because, you know, conceit is some kind of, we might say, a leftover from identity, but it's very subtle, therefore it's different from identity, because identity means I am this, I am that. Conceit means there's a satisfaction with the knowledge that is comprehended. And you see, this is the difference between the two. Identity is very raw, very ugly. Conceit is still ugly, but it's not as raw. It's very subtle. It's maybe harder to grasp. But the moment you know something and you feel, you know, proud that you know that, at that moment you have given rise to conceit. Not because of a certain identity arose in you, but because of your comprehension. So that is the difference, and that is why identities and conceit are different things. And just because with the cessation of identity, you still feel that there's conceit, and that is why you would conclude that you have not gotten rid of identity. I say it's not true. You might have gotten rid of identity, but to get rid of conceit, there are other feathers in the in between. So what one experiences when identity is gone, the certain kind of a degree of freedom. Well, not necessarily a degree of freedom, but in a way, quenching the thirst towards greed. And I say that it's not a degree of freedom, because if you eradicate the first three feathers, then you attain a degree of freedom. And the first three feathers are identity view, doubt in the enlightened being, its teaching, and its community. And the third is the view that ceremonies lead to liberation. You know, all these three, in fact, you have to see that all these three come, well, the first and the third definitely come with greed and delusion, of course. The second one also comes in a way with greed, because the way you could have doubt in an enlightened being is because of attachment to what your own ideas about the way life happens. And of course, there's also delusion in it, because you simply are restless and you continuously have skepticism, so to say. But all of these, first you shake it up with impermanence, then you see the no self in it, and you see the suffering in it, and then you continue the contemplation, how dangerous it is, where it leads. The moment you see why it's dangerous, and that is a big point in all of this, the moment you see its danger, not the danger that awaits you right in the next moment, but the danger which comes long term, then you will step back and see it for what it is. That, you know, people find delight in identities, but a being who aspires liberation and absolute enlightenment, for such a being, taking delight in identities is to be seen as unwholesome. The moment you understand that it's unwholesome, even greed and hatred and delusion, all these are the three unwholesome roots. And when you look upon greed the same way unwholesome as hatred, let's say, the moment you kill another being, it's hateful, it's hatred in that moment. It is the same way unwholesome as taking identity, because those are rooted in unwholesome roots, in unwholesome fires, in unwholesome poisons. And this is why you will just step back and you say, oh, enough of this. This will not lead me any closer to anything. It keeps you in samsara. It keeps you in the circle because you think that this is eternal, and the moment you think that your identity is eternal, you have already damned yourself to further rebirth of cycle. Because if you want to have an identity, no problem. You create unwholesome consciousness, which will have its unwholesome resultant, which means that you may continue happily your identities. But it, you know, people think that through their identity of whatever race or religion, they will get to heaven. But if your heaven is based on identity, then it means that it's certainly impermanent and brings suffering, that it's not something unconditional, that you're very much still conditioned by your own ignorance. And to think that you are, I will give just an example. You are Muslim, and this is why, and because you have said it so many times in your life that you feel that you have, you know, filled yourself with the pride of being a Muslim. This is just an example. It doesn't mean that it happens only here, but this is just an example. The moment you have filled yourself with this and you think, yes, I go to the heaven that I deserve, now you will go, well, you might not end up in the human world, maybe. It depends with what kind of other deeds the being had performed. But certainly, as you have not eradicated identity, it will continue to be with you and to make you suffer. Even if you end up in a heaven, because if you look upon heavens, then there are at least 20 type. There are sensual heavens, jhana heavens, fine material, immaterial, you name them. All these can be called heavens because they have joyful qualities to them. And this is what people define as heavens. It is joyful. But there are greater things than joy, simply. So this is why I say, just to have some fruits in the future with identities, we have to see the same impermanence as any other thing in here or in the hereafter. So understanding impermanence, suffering, and no self, slowly but surely leads out of the view of identity. And when also the next two feathers are, eradicated, then there's truly a degree of freedom by becoming a Sotapanna, having at most 7 lifetimes of rebirths, and then arahanthood within those 7 happens to be, and then there's no more question of cycles of samsara. And this is the benefit from it, because the moment you eradicated this one, you are 1/3 towards a Sotapanna. And then with the second one, 2/3, and with the third one, you enter the stream towards final deliverance from suffering. And this is, so first you have to just to give as a conclusion a layout, and then you may have questions and answers about this. First you have to see it as greed, And you have to see greed as the same way unwholesome as hatred, as ill will and killing, examples of hatred. Then you have to see how impermanent it is, that this greed just comes and goes and comes and goes in circles. And you have to see how impermanent that is. And then you have to see suffering and no self in it. In fact, it's not necessary to use all three. But if you truly want to see its nature, then you will use all three. And then having seen its cycles, having seen the danger in them and the fear in them, having become disillusioned and dispassionate, one aspires for final liberation, deliverance from this, and having conformity about one's destination, one enters a supramundane experience that is becoming a stream enterer, once returner, non-returner, or arahant, according to the Fetters, eradicated. So this is the layout, to see it for what it is, and then work on it, to give examples. This is what contemplation also means in a way, to continuously see it for what it is. If you have an identity that you cannot get rid of, see it for what it is. See it as impermanent. The moment you see it as impermanent, slowly you are able to let it go, because you see that even if you try to get a hold of it, it will just still move out from your hands as sand. It will just come and go and come and go. And you know, you might think that you played a ping pong game with the three fires of greed, hatred, and delusion, but in fact, you are being played with, because greed, hatred, and delusion play the ping pong game, and you are the ball, and you are not the one who plays with the ball. So you have to understand that these are also called greed, hatred, and delusion, are called the three thieves, because they enter your experience and then they leave your experience, and you don't recognize them. You don't see them for what they are. They come and go. They give you things. They remove things, and you're being played as the ping pong ball, not the one who hits the ball. So this is the origin of identity, the ways identity makes one suffer, and the way leading from identity that is insight into what it is. And in fact, all these things apply to all the other feathers, but as identity is the most predominant thing happening in our world, that is the first thing. You cannot give up any of the other feathers as long as there's identity. So you cannot give up sensual desire before identity, let alone conceit and restlessness. Everything starts with giving up identity views. And when it's done, then there is a possibility to work on the other ones. But as long as there is a view of identity, there's no way, simply no way. And I will give an example. Let's say that you are determined to give up hatred. And then you say that there is a possibility to give up hatred without giving up identity. And then I will say that most of the hate is based on identity. 50% or more, at least 50% of hate is based on identity. So yes, you might be able to give up other types of hate, like being irritated and the weaker ones, but those that are based on your identity simply will not go. So yes, you weaken them, and with all feathers, you weaken all other feathers, of course, because all the feathers most of the times are based on other feathers, such as having identity based on sensual desires, for example. And then you can weaken it, but not eradicate it. You anyway have to give up first your identities to give up then hate in future times. It doesn't happen that you can give up the hatred before everything that precedes it. So this was the blissful annihilation, that is the eradication of identity. If there are any questions that we could discuss or which is worth asking, and in fact all questions are worth asking, because If there's a question, it means that there is a not knowing, that there is a lack of understanding. And if we manage to understand the principles, then there is knowledge about what is wholesome, what is unwholesome, how to handle both, what are the differences. So if there are any questions, then please.
Om Krishna. Could you speak a bit further on identities and others? I know there are no others or no other selves, but when you're out in the world, and let's say you're riding your bike and you gave it ample time to turn, and you're there and you're a bike rider, and here comes this car honking at you because they have to get in the other lane. That's an identity, believing that there's somebody else there. And sometimes it can be a bit difficult. If I was all by myself and not interacting with anyone else, absolutely. But in the interaction with the others that are on this planet right now, it can be quite difficult. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very good question. In fact, there are two ways with which you can handle this. The first way, which I think is the harder one, nevertheless, it's very possible, as I said at the beginning, to look upon also as the human being, the different type of phenomena. That there is lightning, there is the blowing of the wind, there are the waves of the ocean, and there are human beings. And this is the first step you have to take if you want to take this pathway to understanding, that there are only phenomena. There's nothing else. There are formed phenomena. Okay, yes, there is Nirvana, which is not a phenomenon, but right now we speak about identities as such, which is far from being unconditioned. No. So you understand that all things are phenomena. It means that you have to work, if you want to take this pathway, that you want to look upon everything as just a different type of phenomenon, as nothing personal. Obviously, the characteristic that you have to take is the no self. It means that within the mind, within your own contemplation, you have to understand what no self means. You have to see how even a supposed self becomes crashed and smashed by impermanence. And if you have contemplated so well the no self, you can look upon all phenomena as just phenomena, as nothing particular, because we tend to look upon the human being as a different phenomenon. But in reality, it is just another phenomenon, nothing else. And if you look upon it as such, with the no self, then you understand that as a different type of phenomenon, aka the other being, it also has greed, hatred, and delusion, the three roots, the three poisons of unwholesomeness. And then the no self, it is another phenomenon. As you understand this mind with the no self as just a phenomenon, you understand that that mind there is also just a phenomenon, that there's nothing particular, because this is identities when we think that there's something particular. And then you understand there is no particularity, because that's just another type of phenomenon. And if you understand that there's just phenomena and phenomena and phenomena flowing like a river continuously and continuously changing, then you will look upon another being who is angry as well as just a phenomenon, just a momentary happening, and that's it. The other pathway is to, well, maybe if you don't understand very well what phenomena means, that there is no self, instead if you can look upon the aggregates, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And just again to remind, mental formation is views, opinion, choice, all these things are mental formation. And then you look upon the mental formations of the other being, and you understand that those come to be through ignorance. All mental formations are conditioned by ignorance. And then you understand that right now that being has that kind of experience. And by the law of cause and effect, you understand that it comes from something else, that is not something eternal. You only suffer being offended when you think that something is eternal. That being said something about you, and right now it has to have a real reality that it's truly so about yourself. If you have not taken the no self, you take the impermanence, and you understand that that being's anger is a consequence. It's not something eternal. This is how you destroy eternalism once and for all. And when you understand that it's just impermanence and it comes from another type of suffering, here it is as a consequence. Because what happens is the following. You have unwholesome hatred, which creates unwholesome objects in your near future, which are seen as not non-pleasurable objects. And then when you encounter, this is called investigation. When there's an object and you investigate it, and within your mind is called unpleasant, at that moment you have an unwholesome investigation in the sense that it came from unwholesome, creating unwholesomeness within you. And then the being saw something which they experienced as unwholesome, again due to unwholesome deeds, and then they again react. This is why it's a circle, because there is a creation of unwholesomeness, there is the result of unwholesomeness, and to the result of unwholesomeness, let's say that you have greed, and because of this greed you cut yourself as a result. And when you cut yourself, you again have hatreds, and then you do something, there's something else that happens to you as a resultant consciousness, and then you don't like it, and then the cycle continues. And this is what is meant by the cycle of, this is the very basic description of the cycle, but a very relevant one. And you understand that if there is a being which is angry at you, and you don't take the no self part, you take the impermanent, you understand that it is a consequence that they experience it. They hold the seed. They planted the seed to have that anger. It doesn't come from you. It comes simply from their mind. The mind gave rise to it, and the mind will make it dissolve and then rise again if the case. So you have to understand how impermanent experiences are. And when you said somebody, let's say, yells at you, as an example, well, the formations are consciousness and feeling. They experience something and there's an unpleasant feeling to it. Yes, there's also perception, but feeling and consciousness is very powerful. And you have to understand that consciousness is also impermanent. Experiences are also impermanent because they happen moment to moment. It's not like an eternal ray of consciousness. No, it is just moment to moment. It just happens. And if you understand how impermanent any of the experiences is, or you cannot simply give credit to them. You cannot simply say, yes, that is so or that is not. So you simply see the impermanent as impermanent. If there is hate in another being, I also want you to understand that hate cannot be done with right view. Whenever there's hate, there's only wrong view. You cannot hate from right view. And then you see how impermanent that being's experience is, and it is only because of the lack of knowledge of the Four Noble Truths that they commit to unwholesomeness. And then you understand the phenomenon that it comes from the lack of understanding, that it's impermanent, and that moment, of course, you might still, if you still feel unwell with what happened, then you have to contemplate the no self. And once you contemplate the no self, you understand that there is no being, there is no experiencer, soul, or whatever that you would call you or he, that there is nothing in the being, nor in you, nor in this formation. And at that moment, whatever might happen, you will see it as just the colors, various colors of happenings, and that's it. And then with impermanence or no self, you see also the other wants, so to say, of the outside world as just a consequence, as the consequence of conditions, that their past deeds led to this life, which has this and this capacity. It's also impermanent, it has also no self, and it leads to suffering, to find any type of self. So you simply detach, and you also understand, for example, that if somebody says something to you, some so-called harsh words, if you have contemplated well and enough, you know that also words don't have a meaning, and a wise person would never use harsh words unwillingly. Even if they use it to enlighten, to shock you out, not to hurt. And when people use words to hurt, certainly they don't have the understanding that words don't have a meaning. And then you understand that words also don't have a self, nor the formation that uses those words can have a self, nor does this formation who receives those selfless words from the selfless formations has a self. So selflessly, you move in a selfless world with selfless other formations, with selfless experiences, continuing to follow the path. And this is our answer.
Moz, do you all have any questions or anything you'd like to say, please, before we conclude this? Thank you. And thanks for that answer, Krishna. Thank you.
This is Bobby. That was very interesting, Krishna. Thank you. And it just makes me wonder why, as here being as human beings, why really, and I'm sure this question is always asked, why we exist at all. We have to take so many steps back and forth and jumping, it seems like, from world to world. I don't know how else to say it, but there's some kind of balance we have to flow between, since we are here in this human form. So it's just, I'm just curious about that. Why are we even here? Thank you.
Okay. So interesting questions. I always have to speak about two pathways about these ones. I might as well just call this recording the understanding of twos. Okay, just joking. Okay, so the first answer that I would give, which will not satisfy you, is that by understanding the no self, you would not feel that you are here or anything is here. Rather, you would be the witness. You would, and the witness is no longer in the realms of the conditioned things. The witness means that it, well, as the word says, it just witnesses. It does not observe, as we have already made a distinction between observing and witnessing. You just witness all these formations. So at that point, you understand that the I-ness comes from the grouping. The moment there is a speck of memory, already you can create an I-ness out of it. So the I is not eternal. It comes to be from memory. The moment you have some kind of memory, you might as well try to assume an I, a self, a being. But it doesn't mean that the memory itself holds any kind of being in itself. So by contemplating the no self, simply arrive to the conclusion that I have never existed because there is no I, nor does the world exist because the world doesn't have a permanent reality. Everything is just a scattering color rain, and then just continuously seeing things as having no self, you will not ponder how I got to come here, because there is no I that got here. Because now you ask about the experiencer, why do we experience? And I again say that even if you assume an experiencer, it's also impermanent. And if you say it, but then still there's all the moments there's an experiencer, then I say that it is in a way attachment to appearances, that the experiencer appears to be always present, but it's always a different type of happening that happens. And why we refute an experiencer is because what happens is there is the mind, and there is the experience in question. And it simply happens that in the mind, suffering is born, that suffering rises, and then the being calls himself or herself a sufferer. But in fact, what simply happened, there was the mind, and in the mind, suffering came to be. It does not include any kind of subject. It is simply a phenomenon, suffering, joy, whatever feeling it might come with, that there is no real experience. It comes from assuming a self, which of course is removed by understanding impermanence. That if you continuously try to find a self, you may assume one, but you continuously have to refute it with a continuous change, with impermanence. And just because you keep assuming it, it doesn't mean that it's still there. It is just attachment to appearances. And that is why one experience is the being an experiencer, rather than the mind just going from one state to the other one, purely impersonally, selflessly entering these realms, not with a self, not with an I or anything belonging to that I. Simply the mind happens to go into those states, and then because of its memory of whatever, it assumes an I, and then it builds everything on the I, whereas the I is just a consequence, it's not something there, and as a consequence it cannot be real. It gets another type of formation, which means that it depends on the previous act, namely not understanding that this is just simply the different types of phenomena entering and exiting the mind. And the other pathway with which I would say, why do we experience at all? Well, in fact, there are several questions to which not even the Buddha gave answers. Well, 4 of them is what happens to an Arahant or a Buddha or a Pacheka Buddha after the body dies. That is one question which has never been answered, nor the question of origins, like where does everything come from? And normally we say that, or where is the end of, so to say, creation? But as creation and dissolution are not particular in your question because you asked about the experiencer itself. But of course, I would like to share what I saw in this. Simply that, this is always called a dream, because it's like, it seems to be real, but it's simply, this is what is called by Maya. Maya means measurer, but it also means in the metaphorical sense, the illusion that there's continuously motion and everything. How you can understand it as is that when you go to sleep, you don't move an inch and you still dream that you run here and there. The same way when you wake up and you feel that you run here and there, the witness now doesn't move. The witness never moves. Now, there are the 2 different planes. There is the, how could we say, the unconditional reality, and then the conditional reality. As we say, Satchitananda is the unconditional, pure existence, pure bliss, and pure presence consciousness, but it means pure presence. And then there's the conditional, which is Maya. And those are not to be seen as absolutely independent realities. Well, Satchitananda is independent of Maya, but Maya's existence is dependent on Satchitananda. It means that simply, when there is pure existence and then there is Maya, and in order for Maya to exist, there is pure existence. You have to look upon it as a shadow. If Satchitananda or, Brahman would be a light source, and then Maya is the shadow. You have to understand, people say that there is no light without dark, no dark without light, but it doesn't come from inside, it comes from opinions, because the fact is that the light, if we speak about physics, conditions the shadow, because without the light source there would be no shadow. But it's not true that the shadow conditions the light source, because what does the light source care whether there is a shadow or there is no shadow? It just shines independently of the shadow. The same way can be described the reality of Satchitananda and that of Maya, that the shadow happens because there was a light source, and it means that there is some kind of object that makes the shadow happen, but it neither of the Satchitananda doesn't depend neither on the object in question nor its reflection. So this is how you can see how anything comes to be. It is said that these are realities. Maya is very much a reality in the sense that it keeps happening, and then there's the Satchitananda, and it is not true that they coexist independently, because Maya depends on pure existence, unconditional existence, whereas unconditional existence doesn't depend on anything. That is why it's unconditional. That there is the witness, but when the witness assumes that they are the experiencer, Maya begins. When the experiencer understands that the whole time they have been the witness, Maya disappears. So this is how you can look upon it. There is the witness and there is the doer. The doer is the Maya, and the witness is that which is beyond Maya. And when there is a pure witness, then there is no doership, namely there is no self. And when there is the doership, then there is an assumption of the self, and it means that there is no witness. So you have to look upon this as such. We always look upon many times to Satchitananda or the absolute reality as the witness. That is to say, just independently being the witness of, well, not in the sense that it observes, simply as a presence, being the witness, being a presence which is unconditioned, which doesn't depend, whose presence doesn't depend on the presence of something else. And then you might look upon beings. What we say that beings arise and cease, it simply means that in the ocean of life, that is pure existence, if there is some kind of encapsulation of life with memory, a being happens to be. That is what it means. When the witness doesn't doesn't comprehend that it's the witness and not something else, then Maya happens to be. And now, right now, you might ask me, how come a pure witness can become a doer, or observe itself to be a doer? And we will say that this is something that has never really been answered, because it doesn't change anything, in the sense that even if we knew how a pure witness, can assume that they are the doer, it simply doesn't help anything because still the feathers would be there, still there would be suffering. What we can say is that, Maya just happens, and in Maya, all those continuous fluctuations happen to create formations, and then the formation assumes a doer, and when the formation realizes itself as just a formation, then they they arise within themselves the witness, and then this is what final liberation would mean, to dissolve, to be the witness, so to say, to witness that to that point that there's nothing beyond. Because if you say that the witness is the I, the self, and I say that, then there's a witness which witnesses the self, so you can go beyond to the point when you cannot move any way beyond because you have attained to the beyond. And this is how you can see that in Maya there are formations that come and go, and then when the come and go understands that they don't come and don't go because they have always been the witness, then there is moksha, final release, because if there is a witness, then none of the feathers can be potentially there.
Thank you, Krishna. I witness you. Thank you.
So shall it be.
Anyone else like to ask anything at all before we wrap her up? Please. Okay, it seems like not. So Krishna, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. You agree?
Yes, very much so.
All right. Thanks everyone for being here.